Welcome to this session where we're going to be talking about planning SharePoint intranets, particularly the strategy side of it. There's lots of stuff out there telling you how to configure SharePoint, not a huge amount on how to actually approach the project itself. So that's what we're going to do today. Joined with my colleague Ben here. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
So Ben, obviously, this is today's session. We structured it because it's designed for the people who get involved in intranet projects, generally who might not be, deeply technical. So internal comms, HR type roles, these are the people where intranets often end up. IT directors, managers, often the people asked to go and find who we're going to use to implement our intranet. And maybe though you're a SharePoint expert and you're looking a bit beyond saying, well, what's the strategy to implementing it? I know how to create pages and sites, but what should I be considering? So that's who we've targeted today at. What are these people going to walk away with, Ben?
Yep, so going to run through some common misconceptions that people sometimes have about the intranet. We're going to think about the needs of the consumers of content versus the needs of publishers and how that organizes into what type of content we need. And ultimately, we're going to be talking about the keys to or key steps even to a successful intranet.
Excellent. So before we get into the steps, I do a lot of calls with people planning their intranets, and some of the things that I hear, I put on the page here, and I thought maybe we should just run through these just to get these out of the way early doors. So the first thing I hear is, great, we get the internet, everyone can have a site, because everyone's got a story, right?
Yeah, so no, I don't recommend this at all. Ultimately, that the intranet is not about creating a democracy. It's about creating the right places that people can do what they need to do. The intranet is a tool, and there's nothing worse with having a load of empty spaces or spaces that haven't been touched for 2 years because someone had a bit of a go and then they had to move on and they didn't have time to keep it up to date.
Okay, so that's number one. Number two is often this is maybe for some organizations their first steps into SharePoint, and then everyone's excited because finally we can start collaborating on SharePoint. So I have my area in SharePoint where I can publish my stuff, I can do my work. Is that right?
So again, so if you've seen some of our previous webinars, we did a webinar on how to structure SharePoint, and we talked about the three sort of key use cases. We talked about publishing, collaboration, and filing. So the intranet is very much aligned with the publishing use case. It's not a space to create collaboration and day-to-day work in that regard. It's about publishing resources and supporting knowledge sharing.
Okay. And then the third one, it's an IT project, right? We're using technology. This is something that IT need to be leading.
That is a big no. It definitely needs to be led by the business. It really needs sponsorship or buy-in from the executive leadership team so that they can be promoting this and making sure that people are given the resources and the time that they need. So absolutely, it's a business project.
But I think what we do see is IT being the part of the organization which goes and finds the supplier, potentially because they've got experience of interviewing suppliers, knowing what good looks like, and maybe have a network of other IT managers who have worked with maybe organizations like ours who implement intranets.
Yeah.
But once that's found, let's find someone in the business to own it. And then, yes, the big thing is let's get this live, and then thank gosh, our work is done.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So there is so much effort that goes into the process of launching all of the content that needs to be put in, but you really do need to have a plan for what happens afterwards. You need to think about how this is going to be kept fresh and how we're not going to be having the same conversation 2 years down the line when perhaps it just hasn't been kept up to date because people have gone on and done different things.
And at which point everyone's blaming the technology because I've seen it before. Given all this, obviously we deliver a lot of these projects. You have a process which you follow, Ben, which helps alleviate some of these and tries to make sure that we deliver a great experience and ultimately a great product at the end of it. And that's these 6 steps. So I know we're going to cover these today in the session, but I thought we might just cover each one at a very high level, and then we'll dive into the detail. So purpose, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really thinking in this case, why are we here? Why are we doing this intranet project? What is it actually going to achieve and how are we going to measure it?
Okay, so that's going to set the framework of why we're doing this. I've agreed that. How do I get started?
So yeah, we then need to start putting our project team together. We need to think about the roles, who's going to be responsible, who's going to be an owner of the intranet, who's going to be involved in populating content, and how do we manage that change across the organization.
Okay. Which then leads us nicely onto design. So I've got my sort of direction of travel, maybe even my North Star. Now, how do I deliver against that?
Yeah, exactly. So this is the point we're starting to define how the intranet is going to behave and what it's going to do. We'll be thinking about the structure of our information. We'll be considering broadcasting versus sort of gathering of information, and we'll be thinking about which tools in the Microsoft 365 space typically that you'll be using, whether it's SharePoint, Forms, Viva Engage, etc.
Okay, so those Microsoft tools there. And I think it's just worth saying, even if you're not going down the Microsoft route, I think you'll still get a lot out of this session today. The build, though, very much is the Microsoft side. Plenty of things going on here. Finally, right, we're on the platform now and we're configuring. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah, so finally we're getting hands-on. We're going to tinker and build things. So yeah, it's what is within that tool set we're going to use. We need to think about our brand, our content, our images, thinking about page templates, SharePoint sites, permissions, all of this good stuff.
So yeah, quite a lot going on there. And that's often where many people start their projects. So interesting that so much has happened before we get to that point. Now, you've built something, but at this point we don't have content, do we?
No, we do not. No. So effectively what we have at this point is a skeleton that is empty and waiting to be filled in with lots of content. And for a lot of organizations, actually, this is a bit where it really gets quite difficult, because this is where we need to get those content authors in, start populating that content. They need to be trained, and we need to think about what our launch date is and what we're working towards to get us there.
Perfect. Now, we said earlier, go live is not when it finishes. There's still more work to be done afterwards.
Yeah, so how do we keep it up to date? How do we make sure that we respond to change in needs from the organization, or perhaps changes in tech? What do we do when people leave the organization and we need to bring on new people to maintain maintain these areas? And how do we respond to user feedback, for instance?
Okay, useful. Right. Well, without further ado, let's dive in. When we think about purpose, I think a lot of people say, right, this is about our culture. Finally, we can get our culture back on track, because if we have an intranet, then everyone will be reading the same thing. Is an intranet going to fix our culture, Ben?
That's a good question, Rupert. The easy answer is no, it is not. So what the internet is going to do, the internet does not define your culture. The internet reflects and amplifies your culture. So if you've got a poor organizational culture where people are unhappy, the internet is not going to necessarily make that better. Culture has to come from the top. And I certainly read somewhere that if you don't define your culture from the top, then it will define itself, and it may not be the culture that you want.
Okay, and there's actually a quote here from Satya Nadella here at Microsoft, actually, saying, "Look, as a CEO, that is my job to set the organization's culture in the right direction." Now, that is helpful. And so, if you've got that positive culture, this is going to amplify it. That's fantastic. The next thing we talked about is, how do you build a business case? How do you persuade people that this is a worthwhile investment? Because SharePoint projects, I know because I've seen enough of them, it can often be tricky to say, what's the ROI on this? But I think there are some metrics we can put together which will help people understand the value that the internet can bring.
So yeah, so this is where we're talking about these key success indicators. So as you say, for some people, this could be a bit of a new concept, but what we're trying to do is get a quantitative way of measuring whether this thing has achieved its purpose. So when we look back on it in 2 years' time, we can say, tangibly say this was worth it, this was worth the money. So that could be, on a productivity side, it could be things like reducing the number of queries that go to HR, IT, marketing, or other support functions. So we're reducing the time that people in those roles need, because a lot of people can self-serve the content themselves. If perhaps you're in a sales team or an operations team, it could be reducing the time it takes to achieve something, because the information is published, it's easy to access, it's consistent, and people know where to go to get it. On more of an engagement side of things, it could be looking at things like net promoter scores and capturing those on a regular basis. And ideally, you want to see that trend go up. And then finally, perhaps a bit more of a trailing indicator, it would be looking at things like staff retention rates. And can we see that there's been a drop-off in staff turnover as a result of people feeling that they're more connected to the organization that they belong to, for example?
I think the bottom right there, Ben, is one certainly when we see when organizations go through acquisition and you're bringing on maybe, you know, a new cohort of people into your organization. How do you make them feel part of your organization as quick as possible, make them feel safe? And that, you know, an intranet could certainly help do that, particularly if you're thinking about distributed offices and that kind of thing. And up on the top left, where we're talking about protecting, you know, your key staff, your HR staff, your IT staff, your marketing staff, yeah, really good KPIs. Well, asking them what questions do we get asked the most? Well, let's see if we can answer that for people before they get to you, and give you more time to do, you know, the rest of your job. So some interesting metrics there. Moving on from that, Ben, you touched on something there about productivity, and I think, you know, I say two sides. There is a bit of blur between the two, but we have productivity on one side, engagement on the other. Could you explain what these terms mean? Because I know we're going to refer back to them, you know, through the rest of this session.
So when we think about what an intranet is meant to do, we've really kind of boiled it down into two key areas. So it is going to improve productivity and it's going to improve employee engagement. And those are the key things that we're measuring against. I'm sure someone may come up with a third one, but I've yet to find it. So when we think about engagement, it's things like, you know, promoting employee events, it's facilitating conversations, particularly if you're an organization that is perhaps a bit geo-dispersed. It's about creating those connections. It's about getting feedback. It's about broadcasting out news. And importantly, it's about setting out your values, your mission statement, what it is that the organization does. So if I think about how I feel connected, it's through these types of things that I can feel a bit more connected to that organization. The intranet's there to help us with this. On the productivity side, it's looking at really that bottom right one, which is the single source of truth. You know, I don't want to have to go around looking for things. I don't want to find that there are 3 different copies of the same thing and I'm not sure which one is right. And that could be policies, so I'm clear on what I need to do. It could be standard signposting to resources such as templates, case studies, brochures, and having a decent search capability of being able to find that content and get the right answer. That's just going to reduce the time it takes to achieve my daily tasks and make me more efficient or help me become more efficient. So it's really all about that, improving the efficiency of what we're doing.
Okay. And looking at these, I mean, I think the weight varies dependent on the kind of organization that we're working with. You know, is it more on the engagement side, more on the productivity side? And there's a few, I guess, indicators that we see which will drive that one way or the other. So maybe, Ben, you could run through these.
Yeah, so the reality is that it's rare that you're going to have a 50-50 split in your priorities between productivity and engagement. Depending on your organization, there's going to be a balance of that. And what we tend to see is perhaps the smaller organizations, their focus of the intranet is more going to be perhaps around productivity because their culture may be working well for them if they're all co-located and they all know each other and the culture is quite well defined as a small organization. But as a company gets bigger, the intranet probably will take more of a focus in that area to support it and create some of those connections for people that wouldn't normally sit next to each other or be able to contact each other quite as frequently or regularly. Again, as I've kind of already touched on, if your organization is quite centralized, particularly if you all have to go to the same office, for instance, then you probably don't need to worry as much on the engagement side and you'll focus more on the productivity side. But if you're quite distributed, particularly across regions, for instance, then being able to create these networks, the intranet is going to be a key tool to be able to support that and make people feel that connection with the larger organization.
I know, Benny, you've certainly worked on projects for, you know, very large organizations where it's purely been about engagement. They're global companies and it's about bringing people together. Productivity, that happens somewhere else. So, you know, there are those examples. And then the final one here, Ben, is the different kinds of workers that we see. So it's the information worker. So these are Microsoft terms, but, you know, just to explain them, information worker is somebody who's predominantly in front of a laptop PC all day long. That's how they do their job. A frontline worker could be someone on the shop floor or working maybe, you know, more hands-on manufacturing. And so they're more likely to be accessing the intranet to be, you know, as part of the engagement side. That said, they're still probably looking for policies and procedures, that kind of thing, but tends to be more on the engagement side of, you know, what it is to be part of that organization. So, but if we've now sort of shaped the priority, I think the next thing is let's start building the team because we've got the priority, we've got our KSIs, we understand, you know, why we want to do this. So should we start building that team?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to run through each of these roles. So there are some key roles here that we need to consider. The first is the business sponsor, who is going to be the person that is really sponsoring this and pushing this as a priority. Ideally, they're a senior level person. They sit within the leadership team, and it's got that high enough level of buy-in so that the rest of the organization sees this as a priority. It should not be led by IT. It should be someone perhaps typically in a HR role. To be honest, sometimes in slightly smaller organizations, it might be marketing that drive this. But yes, it's very much a business focused role that is driving this forward. We've then got the project manager. I mean, this is such a key role. This is going to make sure that all the various different moving parts are going to happen. The different content owners are going to be able to meet their content plan, that there is a clear goal that people are working towards in terms of an end date, that we're moving everything forward, breaking down some of the barriers in terms of getting things done. So that's kind of a, should be fairly self-explanatory. Now, our most important role, to be honest, is those content authors. They're the people that are going to feel the biggest brunt of this initial impact in terms of what they have to do. They will need time set aside alongside their day jobs to actually focus on putting content, ideally if they can be seconded for a period of time, for instance, and they will need a level of technical skills, not extensive technical skills, but they will need to be reasonably IT savvy in terms of creating content and be able to use these types of web publishing tools. And then we move on to senior managers. They're the people that are going to support those content owners by making sure that they can be assigned and have that time set aside for them. They are the ones that are going to help ensure that the project is prioritized amongst all of the other things that are happening. And again, that comes all the way from the exec team, but down into the different departments heads, because it's not going to be the heads of department that create that content. They're going to find the people in their team to be able to support it. Now, we have this role here, which is the intranet owner, and I ask this question often and sometimes get a bit of a difficult or blank response. So really what we're talking about here is who is going to be, or which department is going to be ultimately accountable that the intranet is serving its purpose beyond its launch. Again, this should not be IT. This will typically be someone in internal comms or HR, although they will often feel a bit concerned that that might imply that they're responsible for populating all the content. That's not the case. There will be other departments that are responsible for putting their content in, but someone needs to have that overall ownership so they can go and chase people and say, look, your area is out of date, it needs some updating. And then finally, we have the marketing team. So they are going to be key because they're going to be defining things like the brand, making sure that the intranet reflects the brand. It's using the right type of imagery, hopefully providing some assets that can be reused. And of course, they're setting the tone of voice. I think what I would say is that that's not to be confused with saying that the intranet should look like the company's website, which marketing will often control, because it is a different purpose, but they are still going to be very heavily involved as the owners of the brand.
Okay, that's useful, Ben. So let's move on from people into design. Let's talk about the information flows on an intranet. And there's the three key ways that we see. So I think the classic is the broadcast, where you've got top down, either coming from leadership or somebody representing leadership, publishing those news articles from one to many. On the other side of a page, we've got that bottom up, where we've got the opportunity to capture information, whether anonymously or whether you want it attributed by doing surveys, that kind of thing. And then the piece which often gets left out of many intranets, which is the sort of the peer-to-peer. So how do I bring people together who might not have always come together to have those conversations? So that's the sort of information flow. Ben, do you want to show us what this might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's maybe demonstrate some of that. So I think probably the first thing is that kind of broadcast we're talking about. So really, this is traditionally what we're thinking about in terms of news. So people are publishing news out to the rest of the organization. A relatively small group of people will publish that content out or other resources for everyone else to consume. I could create new news stories using SharePoint. I can distribute them to different channels, etc., etc. So we'll do a little bit more of that in a little bit. If we think about the surveys or the information flow backwards, the gathering of information, we can represent that, for instance, in an employee feedback page. So what we'll see here is that we have a page on the intranet for employee feedback, but we've actually embedded Microsoft form on this page to capture some of that information. So this is an anonymous form. We can publish it on this page and promote it, and then we can get that information come back. And we've included things like Net Promoter Score questions here as well. But of course, the thing about employee feedback is that people want to understand what some of the output of that is. So you can then go and publish perhaps results from previous surveys that were done, and it creates a bit more of a consistent experience. So if I go and click through into here, I can see that perhaps this is a news page that's been created off the back of a previous survey, so that people can come back and feel a bit more connected, and that what they fed back has been listened to and heard. So as I said, we use Microsoft Forms to support that and embedded it within SharePoint. And then the final part of this is the peer-to-peer. So we've got a couple of different places we can demonstrate this. So I'll probably just jump to our knowledge area actually here. So in the peer-to-peer area, what we've done in this case is actually connect Viva Engage into our knowledge area. So we've created some groups in Viva Engage dedicated to knowledge sharing, and this allows people to start discussions. They can post ideas, thoughts on how to manage a challenging customer, for instance. So I could go and ask a question about that, and then people could come in and respond to give me some ideas of how they've shared. So by utilizing this peer-to-peer content, it's actually going to reduce some of the overhead on the content creators. We're merely creating places where people can connect around a particularly defined topic using Viva Engage. But as I say, the thing I really like around it is the fact that you can then embed that alongside those slightly more published resources, and it creates a bit more of a seamless experience.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we can use that as a conversation around news articles, which might be the trigger, or it might be, as you say, a place where I can access resources, people beyond my immediate network, organization wide, to help solve, problems that I might have or challenges I'm up against.
Exactly, and we've even included a scenario where you can use it to bring in some of the more culture and social side of things by supporting, maybe different, clubs that you might have or out of work interests, and supporting some of that. In our case, our board gamers club that we do occasionally.
Okay, right. Well, let's flip back to the deck, and let's talk about content strategy. So I know when you run these workshops, Ben, because people are starting to think about, right, what we actually going to publish on this intranet. We've had some ideas, and how does that look like? And I think we see it in three key ways, which is sort of I need to know about, you need to know about, we need to know about, and we're doing this in the context of the employee. And so in an I need scenario, as an employee, I'm going to actively hunt and find this information out. So I want to know how to book leave. I want to know how to get a work from home set up from IT. So I'm actively going to find that information, and ideally those resources are there available to me. On the other side, on the we need, this is more about us as an organization. The real engagement side is like, well, how do, why is it great that we're all a together thing? And so we're talking about success with clients, with projects, new people joining, the journey that the company's going on. So you might say the soft stuff. And then in the middle, we have what we say you need to know about. So this is information that leadership or other, centralized functions are pushing out to people. It's not that you're looking for it, but we need to tell you that this is happening. It might be that, you're working in utilities, or you have, you run IT, and you're pushing out a network issue, or maybe a power line has come down and you tell your customers about it. How do I tell that information and push that out so we're all got the same version of the truth? Or messages from leadership about strategy, or maybe if you're in manufacturing, or software, a new product release, you need to know about this. So that's how we sort of group our content and think about how users access it. But Ben, what's this mean and translate in terms of SharePoint sites? Because that's the thing you touched on at the beginning here.
Yes, absolutely. So we're really starting to bring this down into what does this mean in a sort of SharePoint world. And one of the first things that we do need to consider is we're starting to design our SharePoint structure for our intranet, is how many SharePoint sites should we have? Is one SharePoint site enough? Could we do everything in this one site? Do we need different sites depending on where we are? And if you remember from the beginning of this webinar, we said, does every department get their site? And I said quite firmly, no, that should not be the case. So who does get their own site? So we see this as very much on the left-hand side, those support functions, they should get their own site because they will have quite a lot of resources of content that they need to be able to share. And you want to be able to devolve that and use the permission management that you get within SharePoint to say, this site set of users can manage their content, people can manage theirs, IT can manage theirs, for instance. On the right-hand side, when we're just thinking about some of that employee engagement content, we don't really need to create a dedicated site for every single additional department in the organization. Sometimes it's enough to just have a news site that certain people, maybe departments heads have been given access to. They can create the content, but perhaps it goes through an approval process for internal comms to just validate it before it goes out to the rest of the organization. So if they're creating that news content, we can empower people to create, their news pages, etc. But it's going to go through some of those additional checks before it goes out to everyone else.
And I think that's probably more about consistency, isn't it, Ben? Tone of voice, right images. It's
right.
Make sure that everything is consistent rather than fact checking that the client win is correct.
Yeah, and we want the intranet to look nice. We want decent
Yeah.
images, we want decent content. So the internal comms have got more established skills on how to do that. So they'll be able to support it or maybe make some updates or some guidance.
Got you.
And then we've got this section in the middle, and really this is going to be on a case-by-case basis. So it could be, perhaps in that crisis management scenario, maybe an operational scenario, it could be that that particular team gets their own dedicated site because they've got quite a lot of updates that they need to publish for everyone to see. Maybe the leadership team, maybe they won't be having their own site. And actually, in a lot of cases, that content might be managed by internal comms themselves, in which case it could actually be created within the main primary intranet homepage itself. And then finally, some of that content could be tied within news. So as I say, this bit in the middle is a little bit of an overlap. It could be their own site. It could be the news site. It might even just be the main intranet homepage or home site itself.
Excellent, Ben. Should we go and see that then? That would be see how this actually looks on SharePoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump back to that a second. We've jumped back to the demo. So, excuse me. So I think, yeah, let's just take a quick look at how we kind of represent that in a very simplistic way. We have our primary site here where we can go and create news, for instance. But if I'm within people, for instance, there might be a whole load of dedicated content. And what we can see within this, all of this content is actually living within the dedicated people site. I can see because the label has changed there. So we've created this dedicated space for people to be able to create their content and create their news stories, for instance, because they're going to have quite a lot to say. Whereas on the other side of things, it may be that a sales team that wants to share an update, for instance, they don't need a dedicated site because really they're focusing on doing their day job and not, they're not quite so close to needing to update the intranet all the time. So we could give them access to the news site and allow them to go and create a news post. So I'm going to create a news post. I don't have templates, so I'll just go and create that from the blank template for the moment. I could say new customer project has gone live, for instance. Let's just go and put in an image there. Success. Sure, let's go with that one. Why not? And then I'm just going to go and submit that for approval. So what we can see in this particular case is that we've actually enabled approval on these articles. That's going to go to an intranet owner or an internal comms team owner. They'll review it and they'll make a decision if it's going to get published or not. So I'm just going to submit that. Please review my article. Submit.
And I think why it's doing that, Ben, it's important to note that if you're going to put this in place, you have to be timely because if you want to encourage people to write news, it needs to appear, as soon as possible, really, to maintain the buy-in from your wider content or community.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you put too many hoops, then people will be less inclined to do it, but it's getting that right balance. So now as an intranet owner, I can see if I review the approvals, I can see whether or not this article is there. I might approve that. Probably I'll go back and say there's a bit more content required, but because we're doing a webinar, I'm going to go and approve it anyway. That's fine. Okay, so I've pressed the approve button. That has now been published and it's going to be made available for everyone else. Should we switch back to the deck?
Yeah, I mean, it was a good example of a news set. So if you've ever seen our webinar about SharePoint hubs, this is a slide we've borrowed from it. And if this is interesting in how to structure hubs and sites, that's definitely a video worth watching. Part of the navigation, which we saw across the top, Ben, is probably focused on intranet. The rest of it is probably more on the wider how I do business and how I do my day job. Do you also touch on that bit before we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I think maybe let's just jump back to the demo one more time, I think, to demonstrate that. So, so again, as you can see here, one of the key things about this, when you're starting to plan out your SharePoint site, your intranet, and you're thinking about your site design, your intranet structure, one of the key things is that you really want that intranet to be part of a single SharePoint hub. We go through some of the benefits of that in another webinar, but one of the key things is that you get this consistent navigation, which means that as people do move around the intranet, it still feels that they are in this same tool. As I move to the knowledge area, for instance, it feels consistent even if the site itself has changed. It also has the benefit of providing this shared search scope, which means if I go in and do a search for some content in the intranet, I'm seeing all of those published resources and not all of the day-to-day working stuff. If we look at the intranet navigation itself, though, so as you can see, we've sort of highlighted these sort of key areas that you expect. You'd have an about us area for your vision and values, maybe, accountability org charts, for instance, some people headings, absence, leave, and you might see additional headings such as, facilities headings, IT headings, etc. We've got links to the policies. As we said, that's a slightly more restricted in terms of who creates, and things like knowledge as well. So in our case, we've got all of our brand guidelines, technical blogs, lunch and learns. All of our process are published and defined here. If I wanted to find something under sales, for instance, I can see that kind of that content there. So really, as Rupert was highlighting on the deck, which we'll jump back to in a second, it's these first three bits we're focusing on, and things like the workspaces and the hubs is more on the collaboration and filing side, even if these are signposts to get to those spaces.
I think before we do hop back, Ben, while you're there, it's probably interesting time to talk about the difference between audiences and permissions, because you did touch on security a little bit when we talked about policies there.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good point. So we're now sort of getting into some of the details of how we build this, and there's some different ways in which the navigation can behave depending on who you are. So it is just worth sort of calling out this point. What do we mean when we talk about permissions versus audiences? So let's just talk about permissions first of all. So permissions are when we are going to control who has access to either create or view content. If you need to restrict content and it's because they must not be able to see it, we would be using permissions. And the easiest way to approach that is create different sites in SharePoint that are aligned to those people that need to be able to see it. So let's say you had a whole set of resources for line managers that no one else should be able to see, then you'd ideally create a site for line managers in SharePoint, and you control their permissions through this mechanism here, and you'd restrict, you wouldn't just give this access to all staff, you'd just give it access to line managers, for example. On the other hand, though, we have this idea around audiences, and this is really about promoting or targeting content. One of the key things we can do is use it to control what navigation elements we see. So we can see here that this user has got access to this sales and marketing set of navigation elements. Whereas if I switch over to this user and hover over the same heading, that's disappeared. And that's because I've used an audience to target to say only people in the sales team are able to see that set of elements. The same thing goes for our quick links. So I can actually target out quick links and individual links and say who should be able to see them. So the marketing assets, for example, I can say that, again, only sales team can see that. If I jump back to the home page for this user, you'll see the set of quick links has been reduced. And then
just to be pointed
finally,
out, Ben,
yeah,
if I have the underlying URL, I can still access it. It just means it's not
yes,
appearing as
that's right.
on that list. So it's not
This is-
providing security, but it's more about the user experience.
So when people say, I often ask people, then they say, you know, they'll say we need to stop people, or we need to restrict this, or they shouldn't see it. And I kind of say to them, what do you mean that they shouldn't see it? Is it because they mustn't see it, in which case they mustn't even be able to search for it? Or is it because you don't want them to be distracted because it could be noise? So if they mustn't see it, that's permissions. If you don't want to distract them, that's audience targeting. And then the one final thing is you can even do this on news. So I'm just going to highlight within your news components, you can enable audience targeting, which will then control individual news stories that may be targeted to different audiences. Perhaps in knowledge, you might want to share case studies with the sales team, maybe product updates with more technical resources, for instance.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's go back to the deck. Now, obviously, given time, Ben, we've talked about lots of the build elements. So we've talked about the navigation. We've talked about page templates. But some of the things we haven't talked about is brand and also org assets for images and templates. So what is an organizational asset? And I know we've got an example actually on this next slide here.
Yeah, so org assets are technically there's two types of org assets or organizational assets. They are images that you can publish into a single image repository, and they are document templates. And by gathering these key assets and using the organizational assets feature within SharePoint, they can then be published out so everyone can access them in an easy and consistent way. And as we can see from the screenshot here within our own organization, we have created an organizational asset library, and it will appear anytime I go and add an image to a page. I'll see this option to access the images from my organization. So that means you can create, marketing can create a consistent image library and say to people, these are the images that we want you to use in your news articles, for instance.
That's great. Okay, and then I think if we flick over to the demo now, we can actually see more on the sort of the branding side, where we're looking colors, fonts, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, the branding options are a little bit more restricted in SharePoint. I think on the whole, that's actually a really good thing. But of course, one of the key things that we can define is the color scheme that needs to be applied, and also things like background images, etc. So we have this pink and sort of turquoise theme, which is aligned to our organizational brand. And you can define your own branding through the site branding link here. Excuse me. So we can see we've already created, just part of some demos. We've created some new themes. If I wanted to create a new theme, I could go and do that. So I go into the theme designer, choose my primary color. Let's say I want a kind of random color. I kind of maybe feeling, I don't know, maybe I need a bit of pepping up. For instance, I'm going to go a little bit sort of pinky red. I'm not quite sure what that is. There we go. I'll go purple again. So I'll pick this sort of purple theme here, press save, and then you can see on the different UI elements how that theme is going to appear. I'll just choose my text color. I'm going to stick with the white background color and choose my accent color, which is going to be that pinky color again. And then just click next. So again, now I've done that, I can start to see what this is going to look like on example pages, for instance. And in fact, actually, that's even applied it to our home page. As you can see, I'm going to give it a name, another purple theme. Okay, that's fine. It's just having to think. I'm going to press save. So this is now available. So when I go back to the intranet, I want to change the look. That will now be one of the available themes that I can use. The other aspect of this is that you can upload your own font packages. So one of the things that SharePoint updated relatively recently is the ability to choose custom fonts or change some of the fonts. So for a long time, you couldn't change the font at all. They provided some new font packages. And as you can see from the Brand Center, you can actually upload your own font packages now as well. So if you've paid for a font, for instance, you can then upload those font assets and then reuse them. I've tried some of these other fonts. I'm going to be honest. I personally still prefer the default Microsoft Seagull UI, but maybe that's just me. But yeah, in short, you can change the font. You can upload new fonts if you have those font packages available to be used.
Okay, Ben. Conscious of time, just one more question before we move on to content. We saw how you can template pages. Can you template sites? So my HR site looks like my IT site, so I'm driving that common user experience.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of page templates, I mean, kind of briefly touched on that. Page templates are very easy to set up. You can create a page and save it as a template and then reuse it. Site templates is a much more technical thing. You can create site templates and reuse them, but it requires technical skill. It would need to be supported by your SharePoint admin team or an external provider to be able to do that. But it is going to be important because you do want to ensure when you create any new sites, for instance, or if there is a department that does have a need to start sharing some content, it does need to be consistent in terms of the structure, the language settings, regional settings, all of those good things. And you want to appear with all of those page templates that you created. So it is a bit more of a technical thing to do, and it's not a point and click, drag and drop, save as a template, save as a site template.
Okay, let's move on to content. So we come back to the screen. Two key kinds of content we talked about: the productivity side and the engagement side. So I'm going to go a bit more quickly now. What to write for productivity? Really simply, actually, what do people ask those people in those roles, in those HR roles, IT roles? That's what people want to know. So that's really your starting point here. Don't go overboard and upload everything which you've got in your shared drive, because it's just going to slow people down. They're going to get lost in the noise. If you think, you can work back from the goal, if our goal is to reduce the number of, say, IT tickets, well, what are the most common tickets that we can solve through instruction, or maybe even short video, right? So that's one way to look at it. The other way is working forward from the user community. Go and survey the users, saying, look, what can we provide to you to help you do your job to be more efficient? So a few ideas around the productivity side here. I think people find this bit actually slightly easier. This is probably, where people see intranets and sort of the engagement. It's like, well, actually, we're trying to engage people. What kind of content are we writing? So certainly things around your vision, your mission, what do we stand for as a company? And then what's our progress on that journey? What are the key milestones? Let's celebrate those kind of things. Maybe you've just become B Corp and that's something you want to celebrate. Maybe you've done something in the community or charities. And I think the last point is an interesting one, which is, don't feel like all the pressure is we got to keep publishing stuff. How could you create a conversation, get people talking around the news? Ben showed earlier, Aviva Engage for like conversation. So how can we help do that? So think about this when you're writing your content. And you'll have the data. So I think you're right in saying, here, Ben, the data is there, which shows you, who's reading, how many articles are being read. Is it the same people? Is it being read more broadly? That data is available if you know how to extract it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So touched on content briefly. Let's get, two more bits, just launching and then what happens after launch. So Ben, obviously this is when you and your team are hands-on with our clients. So do you just run through this and then we'll move on to the what happens after launch?
Yeah, I mean, I think just very quickly, actually, just one kind of step we haven't mentioned is, once you've defined what your content is going to be, the thing that we advise our customers is actually prepare a content spreadsheet that the project manager is supporting people to ensure it gets populated. When you've thought about all those questions that Rupert's talked about, compile that into a spreadsheet that is going to form your content plan in that project launch, and you're working through that people are setting aside the time to be able to go through and do that content, and it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming that you've got all this to do. It can be broken down more easily. But once you reach that point, and we're talking, you know, 1 or 2 weeks away from the actual launch date here, one of the key things we need to do is go through and validate every page on that intranet. Go through each page, make sure it's looking good. There's no kind of big bits of white space other than what SharePoint already provides. You know, everything looks like it holds together. Click on every link and make sure that there aren't any links that are dead, for instance, that people forgot to fill in because they didn't have time. And I can't stress this enough. If you have access and IT will set it up for you, ask them to create a test user account that you can sign in with separate from your day-to-day account, because you'll be creating this content and you'll have a high level of privileges within your SharePoint site. You want to see what it's going to look like from the point of view of an end user, and that might highlight perhaps if there's images that only you've got access to that you haven't realized. If IT won't set that up because of an organizational policy, then perhaps ask a colleague to be able to go through, share it with them and ask them to go through it with you and click through, and that will highlight if there's any areas that need to be updated. And then, of course, you know, don't underestimate the comms that you're going to be sending out to start building up a bit of excitement. You know, you want to build up a bit of a buzz. Think about when you're going to do that launch and work people towards that, you know, with a little bit of excitement. Sometimes people go as far as creating a little simple SharePoint, like a microsite, for instance, with just a simple, the intranet's coming soon, take a look. So that can be quite an interesting approach as you're starting to gear that up. On the launch day itself, you need to be thinking about making this available for everyone. And the way this is going to be done is that you're going to be giving all of your staff access to the intranet by adding them into the various different visitors groups within each of the SharePoint sites. You want to ideally have some Entra ID groups or AD groups that represent your employees, as opposed to using something like the everyone except external users, because that will ensure that only the people that need to have access to it will have access to it. You may want to consider setting up Viva connections. So this is a way of bringing in the intranet and comms and content into Microsoft Teams. So any content that's shared on the intranet will come through into Microsoft Teams. There's some technical steps that need to be go through. And again, that's the type of thing that you'll be doing on the night before the launch date itself. Thank you. Again, if you have an existing intranet, you want to set up any redirect links, so pushing people from the old intranet to the new one. You'll want some support from IT to ensure that this becomes the default homepage for all your users. Now, often that's something that will need to be pushed out through group policy, so you'll need to make sure that IT are there and supporting you to just go through and do that update again on that launch date window. And then, of course, last but not least, send those comms out to say, right, the intranet is live. Here's how you get here. You know, congratulations and well done to all the content authors that put that effort into it. Let's promote this and really celebrate that that we've launched the intranet.
And I think if we had time, there is a nice way you can do that in SharePoint by sending a news article via an email. But conscious that we are coming up to the end here, so just a couple more pieces. The maintain, what happens after you go live? So use the reporting available in SharePoint, or you can develop your own. We certainly do that for some clients against your KSIs, against your leading indicators. One example might be how much news is being published, and look at that usage reporting to see where what's resonating with people and maybe what isn't, so you can refine your content strategy. Certainly, the mitigation for what will change in your business over time or your organization. Content will, not all content is evergreen. Some will expire, so make sure it's either updated or removed. Your content owners will change as well, so maybe they change roles or they move on. And making sure that your focus meets the need of the organization going forward. What might be needed today might be different in a year's time. So think about that and what that means. And this is, really the role of the intranet owner to keep on top of this. And then I think the last point here, Ben, make it sticky. What's all that about?
Yeah, so we often get asked, is there anything, how can we drive more people to go to it? Why should they go to it every day? We want people to see this news, but what's going to, other than making it our homepage, how can we actually make it interactive with every day? So if there is a sort of killer feature that you can bring onto the intranet, whether it's like a sales leaderboard or dashboard, for instance, or something that's pulling information from one of your other systems, so you can draw that through. We had one customer that the killer feature that they had is that they wanted people to be able to book the lunch, to book their lunch from the canteen. So the facilities team would go and publish on the intranet what the menu is going to be for the upcoming week, and then users could come in and they could interact, look at each day and pick what they wanted from that menu and submit their responses. So that's a power app that we built for them and integrated that onto the intranet so people could go and interact, and that really helped drive engagement. So again, if there's any other features like that that you can think that will bring people to it, having that killer feature will really help with ongoing user adoption.
I know where we've done work in the finance sector, particularly fund managers, having the value of of the AUM, assets under management, on the front page of intranet definitely drives it. That's such a key KPI for those organizations. Having that kind of information embedded in SharePoint is definitely a great way to drive adoption. So next steps, if you're thinking about intranets, number one, go and define your KSIs. This will help you go and get that buy-in, saying, look, I can see the value of why you want to do this, because it's going to protect time of these people. It's going to help build engagement in our organization. Maybe we're acquiring an organization and we want to make sure that we retain those people, make them feel valued. And those are two key bits to get us going. The reason why I put the last one on there is because this comes, much further down the line, but it's probably the bit which is forgotten the most, which is, as Ben said earlier, who's going to own this intranet once it goes live? How are you going to make sure it stays fresh? And we certainly support organizations once they've gone live on how to do that. So that brings us to a wrap. If you're thinking, well, hold on, we've got an intranet and either it's not working for us or we're starting afresh, this is what we do as a business. We do all things information management on SharePoint, and intranet is a core part of it. If you'd like an informal chat with me, you can just jump on the website here and click book a discovery call. If you'd like a copy of this deck, that's absolutely fine. If you click on learn on the top and click on events, all our events have the associated downloads with those, so you can go and get that as well. But otherwise, thank you for your time. I hope you found it was useful. Welcome any comments. Thank you, Ben.